Now that we have discussed the key principles for teaching and learning receptive skills, we can move on to talking about the important points about teaching and learning comprehension. These important points can be similar to the principles, except that the important points look at the more practical ways of teaching, meaning that they offer specific strategies and techniques that teachers can use in their classroom to apply the principles effectively. So you may expect to see points that are similar to those of the principles that we had just discussed. The first important point about teaching and learning comprehension is that in comprehension work, the students cannot directly control the speaker or writer, so it's a one-way communication. This means that when students are listening or reading, they can't ask questions or get immediate feedback from the speaker or writer. They need to use their comprehension skills and language knowledge to make sense of the text on their own. For example, when listening to a conversation or reading an article, students can't stop and ask the speaker or writer for clarification. They must figure out the meaning based on what is presented to them. In contrast, in face-to-face interaction or communication is two-way. The listener can ask for repetition, confirm understanding, or even take a speaking turn to, clarify meaning. For example, in a conversation, if you don't understand something, you can simply ask the speaker to explain again. So in comprehension work, however, we focus on one-way communication. So the techniques you see from here on out are techniques for the one-way communication. The second important point is that most techniques for reading can also be used to teach listening and the other way around. For example, scanning is a common technique for reading, where students look for specific information, like names or dates. In listening, a similar technique is listening for specific information. So instead of scanning the text, students focus on listening for keywords or details such as a phone number or location while the conversation plays. Another common technique is predicting. Before reading a text, you ask students to predict the content based on the title or pictures. And similarly, before listening, they can predict what they might hear based on a short introduction or key vocabulary. These techniques are flexible and they help students in both skills. And later in the chapter, we'll explore more techniques to develop these skills further. But as of right now, as you can see on the slide, these are the techniques that can be used for both listening and reading. The third important point is the main differences between teaching listening and reading, which are control of the text and type of text. So let us talk about the control of the text first. For students, in reading, students actually have more control. They can read at their own pace, they can go back, they can skip ahead, they can focus on difficult parts. For example, if a student doesn't understand a section, they can easily reread it or revisit specific paragraphs. In contrast, with listening, students don't have that control. They, have to follow the speaker in real time. They can't pause or skip or go back, which makes it a lot more challenging to process the information as they listen. For teachers, in terms of control, there is a difference between reading and listening. For reading, the teacher chooses the text and they set the purpose for reading. But once student starts reading, the teacher can't control how fast or how slow they go, or whether they revisit sections or they don't. So students manage that on their own pace and focus. For listening, the teacher has more control over students' exposure to the text. For example, the teacher can adjust the speed, the volume, they can pause when reading aloud to the class or when playing the audio. And if they use a recording, the teacher can decide how many times the text is played. So this allows the teacher to provide more structured guidance throughout the listening activity. Next, let's look at the type of text that should be given to students for teaching listening and/or reading. First and foremost, make sure that you select a listening or reading text that fits your students' level, because listening is often harder than reading. In reading, students can go back, they can slow down, they can go a little bit faster, okay, they can focus on difficult parts, but in listening, they can't do that because they must follow along in real time, which makes it a lot harder for them to process. So that's why spoken English is also simpler than written English. Writers have time to plan, they have time to edit and revise, which leads to a more complex language. Speakers, however, often use simpler language because they don't have time to plan every word. So while written texts may be more complex, spoken texts are usually easier. And as students progress, listening texts need to be a lot simpler than reading texts. Again, in reading, students can pause, they can reread, they can look up words. But in listening, they can't do any of that. So if the text is too difficult, it becomes harder for them to understand. That's why listening texts should be easier and more manageable, often with recordings for support. One more thing that we need to remember when it comes to selecting the type of text is that the topics should be familiar to students in order to speed up or at least help with their understanding. So background knowledge is key to good comprehension. Even if they have strong vocabulary and grammar, students may still struggle if they lack the necessary background for the text that they are reading or listening to. So students learn to comprehend faster when the topics are familiar to them because they can relate to the content more. And teachers should also, try to build up a collection of texts on familiar topics to help students. Okay, either supplementing or replacing coursebook materials, all these sorts of things, which are probably out of our control, but that's what is suggested when it comes to making sure that the types of texts fit the students' level and their interests as well as their background. Next, a wide range of comprehension texts for different purposes. To motivate students, it's important that we implement variety of, interesting topics. They need plenty of practice with comprehension, so, having a range of texts for different purposes is also quite important. So different types of texts like stories or articles or poems or instructions, they keep things interesting and engaging. For example, you could use a practice called skimming with a story to get the main idea, or scanning with an article to find specific details, or even predicting is another great technique where students guess the story's ending before they read it. And later you can have them discuss characters' motivations or summarize the key points. What's great is that the same text can be used for different activities. So after reading a story, you might first have students predict the ending. Later you ask them to identify the main themes or compare the characters, actions or motivations. You could also, have them match new vocabulary with definitions or answer any comprehension questions about specific details in that text. So these activities keep students engaged while also helping them practice different comprehension skills, and that also makes the learning process a little bit more dynamic. So the idea here is to make use of different styles of texts, and different styles of texts also work better with different purposes, different techniques. So the more styles of text you have, the more variety your techniques will have to be used as well in order to, complement the style of text that you choose. When choosing a comprehension technique to teach reading and listening, we need to make sure that the techniques we choose have these three key characteristics. So number one, your techniques have to make your students think. So a good comprehension technique activates students' minds, which encourages them to think critically and process information, and also connect their prior knowledge or imagination as well. For reading, this might involve predicting the ending of a story or analyzing why a character made a specific choice. For listening, students could infer the speaker's intention or guess what will happen next based on the tone or context. For example, before or after listening to a story about, a trip to the mountains, let's say, students could discuss what they might see or hear in such a place. With some background knowledge, their answers become more creative and meaningful, which makes the activity both fun and effective. The other characteristic of your comprehension technique should be, having clear guides. Students need a clear guide to focus their attention. It doesn't matter if they are listening or reading. So simply telling them, read this passage or listen to this audio isn't enough, because students do not know what they read or listen for. So a good comprehension technique guides students, and it might include questions to answer, true or false statements, or a grid to fill in. And for reading, you could ask students to match characters with their actions from the story that they read. For listening, students might organize a sequence of events they hear in the audio. So these guides give students a purpose for engaging with the text, and they help them focus on the most important details. And a comprehension technique that has a clear guide makes students know exactly what to do and what to pay attention to when they read or listen. Last but not least is that your comprehension technique should produce clear responses from students too. And since comprehension is a mental process, you cannot really measure how much they understand in their mind. So the only way we can do that is to make sure that we design or choose a technique that offer or provokes clear responses. For reading, this could mean identifying the main idea of a paragraph or listing key details from a text. For listening, students might order a sequence of events they hear in the order from 1 to 5, for example. To identify whether a statement is true or false when listening to the audio is also one of those, techniques that provoke clear responses, which means the only thing that they write down, the only responses they give to you are just true or false. So you are clear, right? So these things can be used to measure their understanding. If they can provide the correct answer, identify that it's true or false, that means their responses are clear. So we are not really trying to, dig into their mind and see how much they understand in the mind. We measure their understanding by the responses they give to us. And those responses have to be clear, right? If your comprehension technique can help, them think, helps guide them with what they need to do before, during, or after they listen or read, and your technique can make students produce clear and exact responses that you need, then you have a good comprehension technique. So here are the lists of reading and listening comprehension techniques that help make students think. They, have clear guides and purposes for reading and listening, and they make students produce clear responses. So you may take a look at the two lists. Again, most of these techniques can be used interchangeably for both, receptive skills. So yeah. Speaking of comprehension guides and responses, the sixth important point is that your guides and your students' responses can be linguistic or non-linguistic. So what do we mean by that? Linguistic guides and responses are based on language. For example, a guide could be a list of questions, true-false statements, or a list of words to choose from. So the response would be when students answer the questions, write the correct word, true or false, or fill in the grid with information they read or hear. Thus, if your comprehension techniques have guides that involve the writing of words and sentences, the linguistic responses from the students will also involve the writing of words and sentences too. So those are what we call linguistic guides and responses. The guides that provoke written responses, or responses that, have something to do with the language, the words themselves. On the other hand, the non-linguistic guides or responses do not use words or writing. Instead, students respond through actions or pictures or even signs. For example, you might give students a series of pictures and ask them to arrange them in the correct order, or they could underline or highlight key details in the text. So this is specifically helpful for students who may not yet have strong language skills, but can still demonstrate comprehension through visuals or actions, right? So thus, your comprehension technique should make students think, have clear guides, and make students produce clear responses. However, the guides in your techniques can either produce linguistic or non-linguistic responses from the students. The important point number 7 is the most important point, so we will discuss it in a separate video. Last but not least, the 8th important point is only specific to listening skill, not reading. When it comes to listening, the teacher plays a big role in helping students improve their skills. So using English in class is one of those important aspects for this. When teacher talks to students in English, like asking how are you today or what did you do this weekend, students get lots of chances to practice listening in a meaningful way. Even simple things like saying open your book to page 32 could also help students hear and understand English in real life situations too. The teacher can also control students' exposure to a listening text. Unlike reading, where students, can go back and reread, with listening, the teacher controls how often the students hear the text. For example, in one-way listening, students should focus on understanding the main meaning of the text, even if they don't understand every single word in that listening audio. To help students catch the meaning, the teacher should usually play or read the text through once without stopping, though this depends on the activity. It's important not to pause every time students don't understand something, just like you can't pause a radio or TV program, right? So the teacher can play the text again and give students a moment to check their answer. This is also an opportunity for you as a teacher to walk around and check how the students are doing while the text is being played.